I spent 40 years building a life I thought was solid. I had a beautiful home in the suburbs, a wife named Eleanor who was the heart of our family, and a son named David who followed in my footsteps with an honesty that made me proud every single day. When David was killed in that accident on the interstate, I felt like the foundation of my existence had simply collapsed into dust. I spent those first few days in a fog of grief, watching Eleanor move through the house like a ghost, her face a mask of silent, unending sorrow. I believed that losing him was the worst thing that could ever happen to us, that we had reached the absolute bottom of our pain. I was so incredibly naive. I had no idea that the tragedy of his death was merely the curtain rising on a nightmare I never could have imagined. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 nights after we laid David to rest, the silence of our home was shattered by a phone call that would change everything. It was Sarah, my daughter-in-law, and her voice was shaking so violently I could barely understand her words. She told me she had found something in David's workshop, something she insisted I had to see immediately. She spoke with a desperate urgency, warning me not to mention a word to Eleanor or my daughter. She told me I might be in actual danger if anyone knew I was heading to her house. I sat there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, wondering if the weight of losing her husband had finally broken her mind. But the intensity in her tone was impossible to ignore. I drove across town through the rain, my hands slick on the steering wheel, unable to shake the feeling that the world I knew was about to end. When I arrived at Sarah's doorstep, the house was dark, but she opened the door the moment my feet touched the porch. She didn't say a word, just pulled me inside and locked the door behind us. Sitting at the kitchen table was a man I recognized instantly from the police reports regarding the accident. It was Detective Miller, the lead investigator on David's case. Seeing him there in the middle of the night made the air in the room feel thin and cold. He looked at me with a weary, heavy expression and told me that the investigation into my son had been reopened. He pointed to an old, heavy metal lockbox sitting between them. Sarah had found it hidden beneath the floorboards in David's workspace. She opened the lid to reveal bank statements, journals, and flash drives. David had been keeping a record of his final months, and the first line of his notebook stated clearly that he believed someone was hunting him. The journals laid out a terrifying timeline of events that had been happening right under our noses. David had started noticing money vanishing from his business accounts months before the accident. He wrote about late-night phone calls where the person on the other end would simply hang up. He wrote about seeing an unmarked sedan parked at the edge of our driveway for hours at a time. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read his handwriting, describing how he eventually traced the source of the stolen funds. He had discovered a series of complex transfers moving through dummy corporations, all linked to an account that I recognized with a sickening lurch of my stomach. The signature on the authorization documents was Eleanor's. I stared at the paper, shaking my head, refusing to accept that the woman I had loved for 4 decades could be capable of such betrayal. Detective Miller showed me photographs that David had taken months earlier, hidden in the shadows of a parking garage. They showed Eleanor meeting with a man I didn't recognize, a man who, as the investigation later revealed, was a ruthless loan shark operating in the city. David's notes explained that he had confronted his mother after finding the first set of documents. He wanted to go to the police, but Eleanor had begged him to stay silent, claiming she had fallen into a deep hole of gambling debts and was being extorted by these dangerous individuals. She had been terrified that if the truth came out, our family reputation would be ruined and we would lose everything. David had been caught between his love for his mother and his own moral compass. The detectives now believed the brake lines on his truck had been cut to silence him before he could turn over the evidence. The weeks that followed were a blur of police interviews, legal proceedings, and the absolute destruction of my reality. As the detectives dug deeper, they discovered that while Eleanor had never intended for David to be harmed, her desperate attempts to keep her secret had put him in the path of men who viewed human life as nothing more than a bargaining chip. She had been providing them with information, thinking she was merely buying time to fix her mistakes. In the end, it was her silence that handed them the opportunity they needed to take him from us. When the police finally walked her out of our home in handcuffs, I watched the woman I thought I knew disappear into the back of a squad car, leaving me alone in the house that no longer felt like a home. Every memory I had was tainted by the knowledge of the lies that had been living alongside us for years. In the aftermath, the businessman Eleanor had been dealing with was sentenced to life in prison, and Eleanor herself faced the consequences of her choices. I spent my days trying to find a way to explain this to my daughter, and to help Sarah raise my grandson, who will grow up knowing that his father was a man of integrity. We go to the cemetery every Sunday, and I look at David's name carved in the stone, realizing that he was the only one of us who truly had the courage to face the truth. I learned that the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones kept by criminals in the shadows, but the ones kept by the people sitting across the dinner table. If there is one thing I want people to understand, it is that honesty is the only shield against the tragedy that silence eventually builds.